we would say, oh man, we need some more cow poop. Guys would go out 5 minutes later, they're coming back with bags full, right? And so in an area where you're really focused on extreme affordability, finding a free resource to be your admixture, like we would talk about with concrete, finding another free resource to add to your free resource is an absolute win.
모스트 포던 팟캐스트.
Welcome back to Most Modern. Today we have a very special episode. A friend of the pod is coming back on for a part 2. Scott Key, if you remember from our earlier episode, is the founder and CEO of Every Shelter. And today we're going to talk about something that we briefly mentioned last episode, which is running an architecture studio in a refugee camp. So welcome, Scott.
Yeah, thanks guys. Really excited to talk about it.
So when you first told us about this, we were a little hesitant, to say the least, right? So why'd you do it?
Yeah, a term that gets thrown around a lot, at least in my space, and you guys can tell me from your industries, is the term co-creation. And it's been pretty, I don't know, most of the time when I see what it actually looks like in the field, it's pretty hollow. And so it was back in January, we were in a settlement. I was there with the woman who leads our office there from an architecture standpoint. And we were just brainstorming ways to get meaningful co-creation opportunities. Some of the early ideas were hosting like a shelter competition, then just realizing that if we structure something like that, we would need to probably bring mentorship to the table, realizing that maybe in the given, like the timeline that we had for it, that maybe a full shelter was actually quite ambitious. Sam and I started with just a floor, for example. And it really evolved into what it became, which is something we call design school, which was really around kind of an open-ended application of human-centered design principles. We recruited 3 architects from a program out of Barcelona. It's a master's degree around sustainable humanitarian architecture. So we had three architects come in to run this. And we just wanted to see what it would look like for refugees to actually be true partners in the design process. And then part of that motivation is even designs frequently that are done in proximity to the need. So an architect in a refugee camp, for example, even those designs can still fail from a viability standpoint by failing to kind of understand the way things work in a basic sense. And so part of the other motivation with the human-centered design, or like the more open-ended application of this, was maybe a hypothesis that if refugees were the ones actually designing alongside of us, that they would be able to speak into the viability side of it. Obviously, the desirability, feasibility, but can we actually launch things out of this that will work? And recognizing that they were absolutely the best to really understand what would be viable in that context.
I think it's really awesome that it's actually easy to get architecture students to participate in this, but the other half of the equation is refugees. And this is probably something that they don't see that often. So how did you guys pitch to refugees to participate?
Yeah, so the only reason that the program was possible was because of a partnership we had with an organization called Optimism. Optimism is a refugee-led organization led by a man named Patrick from the DRC. And Patrick's just like a total true artist. Anytime I bring people to Nakivale, I like to take them to one of the properties that he has called Freedom Land, where he just basically creates large-scale public art level works. He's got another property that's got a workshop on it, a lot of tools, and a lot of young men especially that really look up to him a lot. And so part of Patrick's role in design school was recruitment, and so we gave him some promotional material. We really developed the program with him. And so he was able to help us build our first class. And it was really came down to Patrick. Patrick had always wanted to have some sort of formal design training. So he was looking forward to the program himself. Yeah, Patrick made it possible.
So tell us about the program itself. What does the space look like? How many people are there? What is the setup like?
So the weeks kind of leading up to it was when our interns started. It finally dawned on them that we had only really taken it as far as they had seen it, and it was intentional on our side. Like, hey, we built a framework, but we're really going to build this plane as we fly it. And we had the first 2 weeks planned out quite well. But we've learned from experience that whatever assumptions you're making are probably going to be quickly wrong. And so we sort of prepared them to be prepared to pivot, be prepared to, test any assumptions that we had coming into this. So the first 2 weeks, the first day, to your question, we're in this workshop, which I had seen pictures of online. And then when we got in it, it was a really workshopy workshop. Not a lot of space to sit. Didn't necessarily feel like the most conducive environment for what we were hoping to do. But we just got started. The other thing that was an interesting first day thing was we had had an essay requirement in English, for this first year. We were like, hey, let's not try to tackle multi-language. I mean, there's 27 languages spoken in the settlement. And so we had an English essay requirement, and we got in there and there were maybe two of the students who were fluent in English, and we just happened to hire a French speaker as an intern, and that was a huge saving grace because French is a common tongue for many Congolese refugees. And so yeah, the first day was sort of like, oh no, are we going to be able to do this? And it was just really amazing to see our interns just kind of roll with the punches on it. And so first day and then really the first week were the basics of human-centered design. What does it mean? A lot of like exercises that sort of got people outside of the box. We actually used an curriculum that IDEO has developed for those first few classes. They've got a human-centered design. I'm wanting to say it's called their field manual. But we really leaned on that for sort of the fundamentals of human-centered design. And really the goal of the first week was just to get them thinking maybe in a different way than they've thought. And then ultimately to get them to kind of have a different understanding of what it means to listen and what tools we can use to listen. And so by the end of the first week, they were going out into their communities. So this is now a refugee camp, a refugee settlement of 270,000 people. And this is 18 students. So sending them back out into their neighborhoods, to their communities with surveys that we had developed together in that class to just start asking really kind of open-ended questions. What are you struggling with? What are you chiefly concerned about? And then starting to get into more pointed questions around, specifics about their life, their shelter, their home, kind of their shelter journey. And then, we all come back.
Maybe let's like dive into
Sorry,
detail
yeah,
there
yeah,
a
let's do
little
it.
bit.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned that the first 2 weeks were pretty well prepared in terms of a program. And I think that's indicative of the intent that you had going in. And I think what really caught my ear is that you mentioned this like transformation that the students go through in the way that they see the world, in the way that they listen. Can you tell us a little bit more about what changed?
Yeah, and to add on to that, it seems like, Scott, you don't have like a set curriculum from what I'm hearing. That basically the curriculum is we learn by doing, and in learning we interact with the community. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we wanted to have enough of a curriculum, obviously, for the first, few days. But then, so then after the first 3 sessions, I fly back to the States. And then I'm on weekly calls, with our team there to just say, okay, what happened and what pivots might we want to make? So we knew that we were going to sort of form this as we went. Lebo, to get to your question around sort of the transformation, I think that really we saw that over the course of the entire program. It sparked for some people sooner than others, as you can imagine. So you're doing exercises like, creating hypothetical inventions. How would you keep rain off of yourself if you couldn't use an umbrella or a rain jacket, right? And just, kind of giving people the permission to not care about budgets, physics maybe, but just starting to think of, testing their baseline assumptions, getting them past their baseline assumptions and sort of really instilling, hey, just because this is the only way I've ever seen this solved isn't the only way that it could be solved. What ended up becoming important, and I'm going to say this without trying to sound egotistical, seemed to be important over the course of the time was my own personal story. I was asked by the students to share multiple times about how many times I failed, for example, before we got something that worked. And they seemed to be pretty fascinated, especially with the emergency floor journey, how frustrating it was and how it really didn't work for a long time and persistence and things like that. So I shared that kind of early in the first day, my own just personal story of just, hey, we experienced this thing, we wanted to solve the problem and no one was thinking about it in this way. And so we wanted to pursue it. And so those kind of themes became really important. And some students it was really quick. And some students maybe by the end of it still weren't kind of exercising that muscle, but a lot of them were, and the projects ended up being really, really pretty remarkable.
How did the students get selected? How do they hear about the project?
Yeah, Patrick was the recruiter. So I think this first year we put a lot of that kind of agency on him. And we actually have a different way we're going to do it this coming year. But this first year we just said, hey, use your discretion and your instinct. A lot of the guys that were in the class, so it was 18 students. We only had two women apply. Only one showed up. That's something we're going to try to correct for next year. I think sort of Patrick's natural relationships were with a lot of young men who really looked up to him. So I believe that really our first class was really kind of, kind of comprised of a lot of those men who wanted to learn from Patrick and wanted to kind of be in his orbit.
Walk us through maybe an example project that you're most proud of from the studio.
Yeah. So I've been talking about this a lot lately, and I sort of start by saying, like, let me get you excited about cow poop. I think your audience, if they have heard the first podcast, know refugees are displaced for 20 years on average, meaning, from an architectural standpoint, you need to build a permanent home. You need to build a good home. That's a long time. In this context, the most accessible building material is what we call a mud brick. So the soil there is very clayey. You can pack the clay soil into a brick mold, just a simple little box with four sides, dried in the sun, and that actually, if treated well, and by treated well, I mean keep water off of it. If you keep water off of that mud brick, then that mud brick is a really accessible building material. You can make it, it's free. And that gives you kind of the bulk of your wall material, right? So I'm giving all that background to talk about one of the projects that I'm most excited about. Well, a mud brick dried in the sun, if rehydrated, turns back into mud. That's why waterproofing is so essential. The bricks at the bottom, the foundation bricks, it's basically impossible to use a mud brick successfully. Even if you trench, even if you use a number of strategies, those bricks are always going to be vulnerable. And when the foundation turns back into mud, the whole house collapses. So it's really, that foundation brick is really critical. I know this is getting really nerdy. Well, this is where poop comes in, guys. So at the foundation level, we use what are called burnt bricks. Burnt bricks is what we would just in the States call bricks. They're fired. It's the second leading cause of deforestation in Uganda. Even if that wasn't a concern for you, it's $50 to the cost of a home to buy these bricks. That is really cost prohibitive in this context. And so what these, they called their team, they called themselves the Brick Boys. They were just really spending the entire time messing around with clay and what can we add to this clay soil to make it more resilient, stronger, better. They messed around with the way that we designed our molds, which actually changed the way that one of our biggest programs, it changed the way that we actually built our molds by their research. But the thing that the discovery that is the most compelling that we're still working on is adding cow poop to the clay soil. They started doing experiments where they would mix this percentage clay, this percentage cow dung. They would do soak tests where they would soak it for 24, 48 hours and see if the brick, survived. Typical mud, obviously, you put it in a bucket of water, turns back into mud, sediment looking thing. They got it down to the point where they could soak a cow dung brick for 48 hours and it would actually come out stronger than it had going into it.
Wow.
It was just sort of a remarkable thing because cow poop is pretty common in the settlement. There's a lot of grazing that happens from Ugandans that live in the area. We would say, oh man, we need some more cow poop. Guys would go out, 5 minutes later, they're coming back with bags full, right? And so in an area where you're really focused on extreme affordability, finding a free resource to be your admixture, like we would talk about with concrete, finding another free resource to add to your free resource is an absolute win. Right now we're sort of on, the refinement of design school. We're having something we now call Design Lab, where we're getting more intense with some of these projects. But it stands to save families $50 per shelter, which is about 1 month's worth of food aid in this context, right? So it's like it is a really significant savings once we get it down. And so, but the technology is not enough. There's the delivery method. How do you get enough of it? When new arrivals come into the settlement. So there's a lot of things still to solve with it. But it was just one of the most. I think that project does a lot to kind of typify like why this program and why this type of program matter. That innovation, it might not matter somewhere else, but it matters to, the over 150,000 new arrivals that have come, recently, right? And so like it is an innovation that may not scale globally, but even in its like local context, it has an enormous amount of reach and relevance and cost savings potentially. So yeah, it's a cool, that's one of my favorite programs, and those guys, they were just kind of on it, from day one, that team was. So
So where does an innovation like that come from? Is it something that you had heard about before? Is it something that the locals bring to the table? It seems, to put it bluntly, pretty far outside the box, but at the same time, you can imagine that it's something that maybe has some local vernacular roots.
it does, yeah. And that's one of the things that I think is kind of understudied in this understudied in this world is that displacement actually causes like a generation of people to lose skills that they would have developed if they hadn't been home. So we saw that with a lot of South Sudanese refugees returning back to South Sudan. There were a lot of kind of traditional practices that were lost in that displacement. You weren't engaged in that trade, that craft while you were displaced, then your kids didn't learn it. So you saw, kind of a generation of people who sort of lost a lot of skills that had been there for a long time. And so, yeah, cow dung has a long history in East Africa. I think interns had maybe seen it on TikTok. One of the early exercises with the brick group was, specifically an exercise around what are all the free things we might consider to add to a brick, right? So, like, just imagine creating a palette of free things that we can find. There's a lot of agricultural refuge that we've worked with, and there are really interesting findings actually with using shredded up sugarcane or the leftovers from maize, corn growing. Basically, it was like, hey, what is free? What is abundant? What can we get a lot of? And what might it do to kind of enhance the durability of a brick? And so cow poop was just really at that point just one of the things. And I think, yeah, the origin was some TikTok influencer, one of our interns just saying, well, might we consider poop? And I think I wasn't there for it, but the way it was described for me was sort of like, thanks. And I think, they became believers in cow dung after some of the early tests that they did. So
What are some of the other solutions or questions that you guys were looking at in the studio? Obviously the building, but you also talk about just quality of life, waterproofing. I'm sure there's other things that maybe even you didn't even realize were concerns until you ran the studio.
yeah. Yeah, so I started talking about the first week. End of the first week, they go on their community survey, and one of the things that I think we did actually accurately predict was that once everyone came back and we started comparing notes and actually compiling statistically the most voiced concerns of the community that were actually pretty universally felt, that students would then start to gravitate to specific issues. So we did kind of accurately predict that once they saw kind of on the board, you know, the main concerns of their community, that they would gravitate naturally to a cause. And we did accurately predict that. It doesn't really matter that we predicted it, but the thing that we hoped for that really happened was each person then had sort of a personal reason why they cared about that thing. And I think that actually matters a lot, because taking a project to the extent that it needs to get requires a lot of perseverance and passion, that if you're motivated by a personal experience, if you have a reason why you care about that matters a lot. And so that's ultimately what did happen, was that when they started comparing notes. So to speak to the five projects a little bit, and then you guys can kind of choose one that you might want to hear more about. You already heard about the bricks. Malaria is a huge problem in the settlement. And it's from a global health public health standpoint, malaria is just something that we've been talking about for decades and decades. And the settlement, sort of the traditional approaches that say maybe the Gates foundations may promote, are still really kind of cost prohibitive here. Bed netting being kind of chief among them. Sexual assault was one that we were a little bit surprised was a focus of this. I call it sexual assault. In our sector, they call it gender-based violence. I find that to be kind of a euphemism I don't like. I would rather call it what it is. In this context, it's really common. 1 in 4 women has experienced it, and trash is a huge concern that a lot of people expressed. And I think maybe more the fascination with what you might be able to do with the trash. So yeah, mosquito netting, and then the last one is water. So this settlement is at what's called 1/3 of the survival rate. It gets people get about 1/3 of the water that sort of global institutions have deemed to be the amount that you need just to survive. So not just drinking, but bathing, latrine use, cooking, etc. So we knew, I'll start diving into that a little too quickly. There are things when you're designing that you can't control. We knew we couldn't control the amount of water people got. And so this team ended up focusing on water quality. And are there ways that we can kind of democratize water filtration specifically by creating what are called BioSand filters, specifically materials that you can find, charcoal, sand, rocks. Can we actually start to create an effective filter that someone could actually put together themselves for their home.
One of the things that I remember from our last episode is how much every shelter wants to empower refugees, give them that sense of ownership, that sense of agency, that they have control over their situation. And water is like one of these basic needs. They're only getting a third of it. So, how did this solution help refugees kind of like take this problem into their own hands?
Yeah. So we knew we couldn't do much about the quantity, right? That's controlled by the government. As a side note, we have the ability now to start bringing partners in, and so we've every shelter, even though drilling a borehole is outside of our, kind of lane, we're working now to bring partners in to start to address that. But as far as it relates to this project, water quality ultimately was the thing that the students cared about. So you need water for lots of things. Drinking is actually only one of them, right? I wash my hands with the water that they get that is considered potable. So safe to drink from a technical standpoint. My hands stunk for 2 days. That is the water that people get to drink. So it's highly chlorinated because that's what is making it technically potable. It looks bad, smells bad, tastes bad. And so the students said, basically, can we create a filter that is accessible for, at the household level where a family could at least filter the water that they want to drink, right? Maybe not your latrine water, maybe not your hand washing water, but at least the stuff that you've got to put literally in your mouth or cook your food with. And so I started working on what's called a BioSand filter, which is a filter that uses a lot of common items that you might find somewhere. And so just over the course of the 9 weeks, that's what they started developing. Towards the end of the project, a decision that got made was, let's put aside the technological development for a second, and let's actually look at what my market might look like. And so we got them off the shelf, tried and true filters to actually kind of prove out a business model with. And that's actually what they've been doing for the last 6 weeks is, what will people pay for filtered water? What does that business model look like? 2 weeks ago now, they've opened a storefront. And so they're just saying, hey, technology agnostic, what can we do here? What can we build? Because it'll ultimately determine how they continue to develop that kind of very local low tech technology. So they've had some success. I think we're learning sort of our limitations on like helping somebody start a business. They're now sort of at a point where they're revisiting technology now that they know sort of what that for pay side of what they do is.
Who's driving these projects and as you guys go? Or is it kind of you and the architects that you guys brought on saying, hey, let's try this, maybe let's stop doing this? Or do you find it very much the leadership kind of comes from the students?
We told the interns going in that this was going to feel like they were studio critics, studio professors, some hybrid between being studio professors and being on the team themselves, right? They have had the benefit of, in their case, 6, 7 years of education with this stuff. And many of these students haven't had the opportunity to finish high school or college. And, we told them going in, sort of expect to be somewhere in that spectrum between just being, a professor and being actually on the team. As it evolved, say with the water project, it really did, on a day-to-day basis, the interns may have sort of oscillated between that more and more. So ultimately at the end of the time of design school, we gave each team what we call an offer letter. It was sort of a culmination of our perspective on it and also their perspective on it that we had developed over time. And it was for the next defined period of time, we're going to give this project this much money, and together we want to achieve these things. And so ultimately there is at some point discretion on the part of every shelter and the team, but those offer letters were ultimately a culmination of really where the project was landing at the end of the time anyway.
So with the offer letter, it kind of sounds like this is an incubator. Like you're starting like mini projects and businesses within these refugee camps.
Well, I would say it's very entrepreneurial in a sense, the way you guys have it set up, right? Like you got to go address a concern, provide a solution, not provide a solution for a concern that doesn't yet exist. And I think that's necessitated by the context.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that we're contending with, right? I mentioned that we knew we were going to kind of build this as we went. As we're imagining next year, there are things about how we cultivate the class, how we recruit students that we want to change. There's things about on the pre-side of the class that we want to add in terms of developing ideas before, this kind of intensive time, if you want to call it an incubator. And then what happens afterwards? I'd say we have two type of projects coming out of it. One that has maybe a pretty believable business case. So the project, so they named their company Aha, Aha Water. I'm sorry, the refreshing sound that you would make after you had something to drink when you're thirsty. So, with the water project and a couple others, there was kind of a clear business case to make. With some of the other projects, there wasn't, there was really not a way to, yeah, just to make money from it, right? And so it is sort of our belief that if something can become a business, that is a great way to scale it. Um, the brick project, for example, so far we have not discovered really maybe a compelling business case for the bricks. And so their offer looked like effectively like a research position with us for a prolonged period of time. Hey, how far can we push this? So we're calling that, we've called that design lab, right? And so can we take this project further, and can the learnings of it actually integrate the way that our programs are designed? So, they've already changed the way that the brick molds that we build are designed. It'll change ultimately the training that we provide to refugees when they arrive at the settlement. So, on the other side of this first year, we're seeing sort of like two paths, a business case and then one that really just integrates into our work. And then on the business case, we are also realizing that we are not the best group to help them launch a business. And so we're pretty actively looking for partners who are like, hey, great technology. Maybe we've proved out a basic business case. How do I help these guys or women, build an organization around this? So we're probably not those people we think.
But it seems like there's a opportunity at least, and maybe this has continued to play out, where you can test the market viability directly in the camp. I'm curious what that has looked like. How have some of these projects been received? Have they been rethought or reinterpreted after deploying them on a pilot basis?
Yeah. So I actually just got the first report back from the group that calls themselves the Mosquito Fighters. So let me actually talk about that project, and I'll get to your question a little bit more. So bed nets are sort of across parts of the world where malaria is a concern. Bed nets have become sort of the tried and true assumption. That's how you deal with malaria. Most infections happen while you sleep because you don't know there's a mosquito on you. 73% of residents of Nakivale have already had malaria. Reinfections are very common. And so one of the biggest complaints that people had was malaria prevention. In the course of the project, we identified that there are kind of three ways to think about preventing malaria. There's the personal level, spraying, DEET, spraying, mosquito repellent on yourself. There's the household level, maybe that's where the bed net comes in. And then there's the area level. We learned that mosquitoes actually don't fly very far in their lifetime. Is it, we in the design process, it was like, hey, you could think about it at the personal level, the house level, or the area level. Originally, the team wanted to kind of pursue like a DIY repellent that people could wear. The project ended up going at the shelter level and focused on bed nets. So in this context, a bed net is $4. That sounds really cheap in our context. In this context, um, but the real innovation in this project was like, hey, what if we thought of a bed net not as a $4 per person, but what if we thought of bed net as $4 for a lot of fabric? And that was really sort of where the project kind of had its like biggest thrust or climax was if we actually think of a bed net as just really cheap fabric, then per meter, it's actually pennies. So then the project turned into how do we mosquito proof an entire shelter, not one person, one bed. How do we actually apply this material to the shelter to prevent mosquitoes from entering the house in the first place? And so that's where the project ended. I got their first report, and they basically, their offer letter was some amount of money to help them kind of take it a little bit further. They're working with seamstresses in the settlement to create nets, and then really having to learn how this applies to a building. How do you close up the eaves? How do you close up a block window that's just transparent? It's not always netting. Sometimes it's a troweling on some mud to close up a gap. Dealing with thresholds at doors, but we basically made them an offer to say like, hey, let's get 10 customers, and what does that look like? And so the first report came back with very happy customer feedback. Still pretty early. They've really just had a few customers, but it was one of the other projects that came out that had maybe a clear business case. You could kind of take it the other direction. We train people how to build homes. We train people how to repair homes. And so there is a version of this project in the future that we will likely just incorporate into our construction training because this is such a remarkable finding. Bed nets, you can find them, yeah, it's just really a prolific resource in this context. It is likely that we will also train others how to make these repairs for their own home so that they're not having to pay for labor. But some people are always going to choose to pay for labor. And so I think this group would like to sort of fashion themselves as like the screening company. Hey, I can provide you a holistic solution for preventing malaria in your
So walking through these projects, talking through how maybe some of these innovations are unlocked, it doesn't seem like materially you guys are bringing anything, right? Like you're not bringing outside material, you're working with everything local, you're not like shipping cow poop to the site for them to experiment with. What would you say is the main difference that design school makes that enables these students to think about their environment and think about their problems in new ways?
Yeah, let me say first then, you need to have a really compelling reason to bring something into the settlement, right? The cost environment here is so constrained that your first look needs to be at what's here. There are compelling reasons to bring things from outside sometimes, but there needs to be a compelling reason to start to do that. So looking regionally, like, can I get it in a nearby city versus like, hey, did it get in a container and get on a boat? That would be the most extreme version of it. All of those things add cost, and in this environment, using what's local and available for free, cost ultimately is sort of the primary driver there. I think what you asked earlier about the transformation, it gives you new eyes, right? When you learn some of these basic principles of human-centered design, or just kind of design thinking in general, you're walking around your settlement saying, boy, there's an awful lot of this thing, I wonder what I could do with it, versus just not seeing it, or just seeing it as a byproduct of a local crop that's grown. And so I really do think that baseline training can spark an imagination that you may not have had, a muscle that you've maybe not developed. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think just having conversations with a lot of these guys at the end of the semester, like those conversations change dramatically by the end, of just sort of like what's possible, what if kind of conversations versus just seeing sort of the world as it comes. I think that's awfully encouraging. It's part of why next year, one of the kind of pre-steps before kind of the design school program are going to be these short courses that are really just focused on human-centered design. Part of that is just like, hey, are people interested in kind of a basic design education? I think that does aid you just in your daily life. I think it's a cool, like learning a musical instrument, or something like that. It's just a new skill, and in this context where we're talking often about survival, or sort of a baseline of thriving, those are really essential skills actually. And so next year we're going to offer like these mini courses where you can come and just get a certificate in human-centered design in the settlement. That's also, for us, selfishly going to help us build the class next year. And we want to kind of take people to this intensive 10-week thing that feel really well equipped for it, that seem really kind of wired for it. And so we have kind of two pre-steps next year before they get to the full-on 10-week program. So but I think for those that take that class, it'll be fascinating. We have what's called monitoring, evaluating. We always follow up with everything we do. We're always tracking, was that worthwhile or not? And so it'll be interesting to see the people who take the mini classes, like, hey, what did that do for you? Did you see tangible good in your life? Can you point to specific examples of something that you may have done differently, or an opportunity you may have seen differently? So anyway, it'll be interesting to see if that's actually as helpful for people as it seems like it could be.
So from a donor perspective, this seems like something where your dollar kind of goes a lot further. Instead of just like buying an item or buying a thing, you're giving someone and giving a community kind of this self-propelling power to continually improve. How have donors received this?
Yeah. So we actually design the time. We do one trip a year where we'll bring some donors with us. We really limit that to once a year. So, they were actually there for some of the final presentations, a group of people who support Every Shelter and have for a while. And it did feel like like a pitch competition. That's not really how we fashioned it, but that really is what it felt like. And so those who had the privilege of joining us left that experience just absolutely stoked. I mean, it was just so exciting to see sort of like the progression and where they landed and the opportunities that they had from it. So from a donor perspective, we're pretty actively pursuing architecture firms, design firms, folks in the AEC world, and we're trying to tell them the story of design school. But this thing that we do professionally has a social impact potential, when applied in this way. And so as we refine that program, next year, hopefully we're doing a lot less building as we go, and we're sort of just really refining a curriculum that we developed over the course of this last summer, adding some kind of precursor steps, and then the what happens afterwards steps, we've been doing a lot of storytelling with a lot of architecture firms, just saying, hey, is this something that you might want to sponsor? I see a future where maybe even virtually people can have desk crits with a team. I think that would be beneficial for the teams to get kind of outside perspectives. From an empathy standpoint, I cannot think of a better way for somebody like, Lebo and Alex, or any architect or designer, to put themselves in the shoes of somebody. It's like, where $4 for a bed net is an expensive, kind of cost prohibitive option, so that a family will get malaria because $4 is something that they actually ultimately can't afford, right? And so those sort of extreme affordability issues, I think, from the side of the person, maybe, um, you know being the desperate, I think it'll be incredibly informative and enriching experience for them too, to just be able to apply their kind of creativity to, come alongside of a team. But I would venture to say that ultimately they might also learn a lot in the process of providing that, mentorship.
Well, Scott, as a friend of the pod, someone who's on for a second time, you get the privilege of being asked our last question again. So the question we always ask is, if you're 30 years in the future, looking back on today, the present moment, how would you describe the time that we're in?
Yeah. Oh man. I think, because of AI, because of the online, the overwhelming nature of the fact that we hear everything that ever happens in the world, we experience what we call compassion fatigue from people. It's like, I know about every bad thing, or I can know every bad thing that's happening in the world. From, every shelter's perspective, we're constantly telling people, hey, you don't have to care about everything, but you should care about one thing. I think as AI develops, and people spend increasingly more time kind of disconnected physically from one another, I'm going to be hopeful, Lebo. I'm going to project a little bit forward and just say that I think the optimist in me says it's going to push people more towards human connection again. I think there's a lot of statistics that show us that people are connecting less in person physically with one another. I think there's going to be a propulsion in the other way. I think it's going to swing. I think that, pouring yourself into a cause, especially one that you can be kind of intimately familiar with, and physically, kind of connected to, and use your skills. So that's my optimism, is that we're going to kind of see, right now we're sort of at this extreme of like our virtual lives, and that we're going to see kind of a propulsion back to, kind of real connection. So how's that? How did it?
I think it's an interesting take, because it's like we're all talking about this AI bubble right now in the financial
Yeah.
markets. But what if the real bubble is actually the physical disconnect that we're all experiencing, and that there might be a reversion back to some situation where we're much more in tune with physical, social, real world connection? I would hope for that. I think we're all aligned in that.
Well, I think the design school is a great example of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm hopeful for it. I mean, I'm sort of just naturally an optimist. And so, um, I mean, to the extent that we can, we'd like to provide people an outlet to kind of engage in these ways. So anyway, yeah. Yeah. I'm hopeful.
So if people want to find out more about these 5 amazing projects, more about design school, about, of course, Every Shelter, where should they go?
Everyshelter.org. Yeah. We're on some of the social media channels as well, I'm pretty sure.
Amazing. Well, be sure to include all the links, plus the link to Scott's first episode, so you guys can get a little bit more background on Every Shelter. And thank you so much, Scott, for sharing the stories. And we hope to have you on the show very soon again.
Yeah. Really great. Really great to talk to you guys. It's cool to be on.
Thank you.
Nice.
Yeah, man.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트